Nice guys, welcome back to the weight room. It is a lower body activity day today. We just finished our lower body push day. And so and that push day challenges your anterior core, your anterior front of your legs, your quads a little bit more, but it should definitely challenge the glutes, the hamstrings, and the posterior chain as well on the backside. So again, a lot of what we're doing here is all about triple extension. So that ankle, knee, and hip action. So 1, 2, and 3. All right, that triple extension. So with our lower body push day, we got a lot of good work in, and this is going to supplement that day. I would not say one or the other is more important. They just have a different time and place and when to apply it. So so our lower body pulling day or hip dominant day, extremely important for challenging the core, the hips, specifically the glutes, and then as well as the hamstrings are going to be the big focus here. So our quads are sort of the aftermath or an accessory muscle on a lot of these movements. Just going to kind of jump right into it. Let's talk about our deadlift. So deadlift is sort of your king of the pulls, and a lot of different ways to go about it. You can go with a big old sumo stance and have a narrow grip, and there's some great rationale for doing that. I'm not going to go too far down a tangent on that, but I would recommend looking up Coach Matt Wenning, like winning, but with the E, W-E-N-N-I-N-G. He's an outstanding powerlifter, and he makes an excellent argument for the rationale for using sumo deadlifts and basically saving the lower back and building strength throughout the body. So I'm not going to go on to too big of a tangent there. I will say that I prefer the conventional deadlift, but I do not use the deadlift as it's not my most popular movement. So if you're going to use a sumo deadlift, you're going to get more quad activation on that, and it's going to be a little bit safer on the lower back and the central nervous system. It will not be stressed as much. So a sumo deadlift, if you're going to use a sumo deadlift, you're going to use that a little bit more often than a conventional. But on a deadlift, we'll talk a little about our setup here. This is not one where you need a spotter. So if you see somebody spotting somebody on a deadlift, look pretty funny. I'm not sure what it would look like, but it'd probably look pretty funny. So with that squat stance, I had, about a little bit wider than shoulder width with my deadlift stance. I'm actually going to be pretty dang close to hip width, and give or take a couple of inches, but approximately my hip width. So going up to the bar, setting up, I'm going to start with my shins against the bar. I'm going to squat down into position. I'm going to grip that bar just outside. Well, why don't we do this? Why don't we turn this sucker, and there, that will work better. All right. So I'm standing about hip width, and my grip is going to vary a little bit to be as efficient as possible. I want my arms as long as possible, and I want to already be standing up as far as I can. So that means when I start pulling on that bar, before I really give up my best shot, I'm actually going to put some tension on that bar ahead of time. And where that bar sits in the collar, or sits in the ring of the plate, there's just a little bit of a gap. So a lot of times you can lift on it, and you can actually kind of hear it or feel it kind of go, clink, clink. So here, let's see if we can get you guys to hear that maybe. So I'm not sure if you can hear this, but yeah, so I'm just barely lifting up on it, and it kind of locks into place. Kind of like you're locking it, when you lock a doorknob, you can hear that same metallic shift go on. So as I get down in position, I'm gonna straighten out my core. I'm gonna brace my core, do a lot of that action that we've talked about in the past, tightening up the glutes, tightening up the belly, that Valsalva maneuver, filling up my belly with air, and then flexing that muscle wall back into the inflated lungs. So that's going to help solidify and brace and save my core. Make sure you warm up before doing all this, especially revisiting the McGill 3 is a great idea to do on a day where we're loading the spine. So that's our setup, stance, grip. So my grip, with conventional stance, a lot of times people are in such a hurry to have their arms as long as possible and straight as possible to give them that mechanical advantage where they're standing up as much as possible, that they're actually going to try to put their knee and their arm in the same space at the same time, and that doesn't work. So what I do is I find my most comfortable power position for my stance, and then my arms are going to be as close to my knees as possible without touching it and without causing drag. So that's basically how I find my foot stance, and then I find my conventional grip after that. Now you can absolutely take wider grips, but you got to understand that that's going to allocate stress to the lower and mid back. That wider that grip goes, that more stress is going to go through upper, mid, and lower back actually. So I don't think I said upper on the first time, but yeah, it has a lot to do with your upper back. So if that is where you're weak on a normal deadlift, then you may want to do some extra reps or sets with a wider grip. Say as far as grip goes, if you want to use an alternate grip once it's getting heavier, go for it. And the biggest thing there is just if you're concerned or if you're starting to feel tight and be concerned about a bicep tear or a lot of stress going through the bicep, that's something to watch out for. So for me, I like to go double overhand. I don't really mess with the alternating grip too much, just because I have a little bit of concern with bicep tears. It doesn't always feel comfortable for me. And since I'm not a competitive power lifter and I have no restraints on how I'm gripping it or whether I'm using straps or not, I don't care. When I deadlift, I want to deadlift to the best of my abilities. So if you have any concerns or your grip is limiting what you're doing, maybe just a simple wrist wrap like that. So to quote Coach Andrew Paul, he was saying something that he said once that I really has stuck with me is don't let your grip strength limit your hip strength. So if I'm working with track and field throwers and they're having trouble gripping the bar when they deadlift, and they say, oh, I can't do it, that's as high as I can go because I can't hold it anymore. What I might say to them is I'll say, hey, when you throw, when you're out in the circle and you're doing, whether it's discus or weight or hammer or whatever it is, shot put, is your grip your limiting factor? Is it holding you back from throwing a little bit further? And sometimes they look at me like I'm a little crazy. No, I can, it's not that heavy. I can hang on to it plenty strong. So I say, okay, well in that case, we don't really need to get your grip that much stronger, right? So why don't we wrap your wrists, wrap your grip, and then let's get your hip strength stronger, because your hips might be the limiting factor in your sport. So for me, that's kind of my theory on that deadlift, because a lot of times our athletes do start lifting weights that's hard for them to grip. And you can just say, hey, does it feel natural or good to have an alternate grip? And if it doesn't, just say, hey, let's get your hips stronger. We'll do maybe, if your grip is really weak, we'll do some grip work later on, like a farmer's carry or a plate pinch or something. But on that, yeah, don't be afraid to change up the grip a little bit. Most important thing here is going to be your protecting that lower back. That's going to be your biggest area for strain. So once I'm set up here, let's see, I've got my fairly narrow stance. What I like to do is get right up on that bar and I'll squat down to start. I'm going to get my grip set up. I'm going to pick my eyes up, eyes forward. I'm going to tighten up my upper back, pinch my shoulder blades together. I'm squeezing that bar. I'm turning my knuckles downward. That's going to get my arm long and neutral. I might take that breath in, perform my Valsalva maneuver, Tighten up my abdominal wall up against my inflated lungs. And I'm up. And controlling it down. And sometimes some lifters, to help activate their posterior chain a little bit extra, when they get down in that position, they'll do all the things I just did, but just before they lift, they'll pop their hips up. And the theory behind that is that you're going to pre-stretch your hamstrings to help activate them to more easily call on them for the lift. And you're going to have varying preferences on how much the hips are actually hinging versus how much squatting action is going on. And you can go down a really long rabbit hole that I'm going to spare you guys on. But it's a little bit preference. It's how much do you actually want the low back and the posterior chain stressed on a given day. And for me, what I've noticed is that a true deadlift is so stressful that I will a lot of times train it or program it in a reserved form. So it can be an excellent and superior option for growing stability within the trunk and the core. But it can easily become too much in that we are just frying our core and our nervous system. It may be a combination of not only straining the lower back and all the muscles near the spinal column, but also working that grip. We went through a tangent on our upper body lecture about how your grip strength is related to your heart rate variability. So when we do deadlifts and we're challenging our grip as well as all the musculature near our spinal column, it can be really taxing on our central nervous system. So training the deadlift with a little bit more reservation than the squat or maybe the bench press, maybe your muscles can handle it on a given day, but it may dig deeper into your central nervous system and your recovery than you anticipated. So I found for myself and for a lot of athletes I work with, if I'm going to include deadlifts with the same frequency as some of my other big lifts, what I'll do is I'll shave back some of the intensity, and that allows them to maintain the frequency without having such a central nervous system drain or fatigue and strain in the lower back. So you can do it that way, or you can bring the deadlift in less frequently with similar intensities as some of your other big lifts. So it's frequent or common that some powerlifting philosophies will squat several times more frequently than they deadlift, and they'll just sprinkle the deadlift in occasionally. So keep that in mind. And that deadlift, I would recommend a pause reps at the bottom just to boost consistency of reps and also to kind of boost safety of reps. When you get moving quickly, the faster you go, the more that can go wrong. So if you go slow and controlled, you get to see more and you can kind of expose mobility issues as well as strength weaknesses. And that, pulling from the floor is fine, and you can, if you don't have any equipment, or, if you have limited equipment or options, deadlifts from the floor are fine, they do the trick. But if you want to play around with it a little bit, you can also do some rack pulls. And I think the rack pulls can be a great option for a few reasons. One is that they are going to limit that range of motion. They're going to limit your range of motion, which means that instead of going all the way down and getting into a fairly vulnerable position, you can just start from a little bit more of a mechanical advantage. So lifting this bar up, when I walk up to this, it's actually above my knees. And that's a pretty aggressive rack pull, pretty aggressive change in height. Even lifting it up a couple of inches can give you a very different feel for the weight, and it will allow you to add on more poundage with less risk of injury and less risk of central nervous system or muscular fatigue. So lifting up quite a bit here, then you're at a huge mechanical advantage, and you can just work the top range of motion, or you could find somewhere in between and just kind of play around with it a lot like that. So lifting from a higher position reduces some of the biomechanical issues that might come with a traditional or conventional deadlift from the floor. Hey guys, my video feed cut out there for whatever reason, so just kind of wrapping up talking about rack pulls and some of the advantages and disadvantages. Yeah, it allows us to pick on different muscles and different portions of the movement, so different sticking points. If you're having trouble getting the weight off of the ground from that base position, you may just want to spend more time on pulling from the floor, or even doing a disadvantaged deadlift where your feet are slightly elevated and you're having to pull from even lower. And then when you get rid of that disadvantage and your feet are back on the floor, it doesn't feel so bad. It doesn't feel like you're getting so low, and so that's a possibility as well. And then if you're getting stuck not from the floor but halfway up here, you can start doing more rack pulls from that position as well. In theory, that should help out a little bit based on picking on both the muscles and the movement. So I think we've talked deadlift quite enough. How about a Romanian deadlift? Let's get talking about that. And this is going to be a simpler movement, and a lot of times the simpler our movements are, the better they are, because you spend less time teaching them, but you get almost as much or just as much benefit out of them. So with our RDL, we're going to focus much more on just hinging at the hips and getting glute activation and hamstring activation. So a lot of the same similarities with our grip and everything like that from our deadlift. And then the goal here, I like the saying of a soft knee. So instead of the knees being locked out, just tell them a soft knee right there. And our hips are going to hinge backwards. And that bar is going to slide down. Don't let that bar drift away. Keep that bar in tight to the pants, to the leg. And once you get to about a 7 out of 10 stretch at the bottom, just squeeze those glutes and stand tall. And again, it's going to look like this. That's our RDL. And the nice thing about the RDL is you can play around with your stance quite a bit more. You can rotate the feet, hit some different areas of the hamstrings. Pretty easy to do a single arm or single leg variation of it. So with that bar, we can go with that single leg and work a little bit more of the balance and the posture. And again, when we reduce stability in the nature of the movement, we increase the stability that our body has to produce. And that's a lot of what sport and real world function is just producing stability. So you can go with the barbell there. You can do 2 dumbbells. See me wobbling there, struggling just a little bit. You can go 2 dumbbells. You can go single weight, single implement. Right there. You can go opposite side, same side, whatever. You have options there. And again, if you want to reduce overall stability in the nature of the movement, that makes our body produce more stability. And that can be great if you have maybe a beginner lifter who doesn't need a whole lot of stimulus. They don't need that heavy weight. They need to challenge the movement quality, and they need to teach their muscles how to fire in certain movement patterns. So low stability, without it turning into like a circus act, like a one-legged RDL on top of a medicine ball or something, without turning it into a circus act, that might be a better place to start versus seeing how much they can deadlift. Because if they're just new to the weight room, nothing wrong with going and teaching them a deadlift, but you have options. As long as it matches your philosophy and you can rationalize it, that's what we're going for. So, you put 100 coaches or exercise scientists in a room and give them the same client or the same scenario, and you're going to come up with 100 different approaches on how to coach them up and what the program's going to look like. And that might mean all 100 programs are scientifically valid and have great rationale, but they're just going to be different due to coaches' preferences and mindsets. Let's see, we talked about our Romanian deadlift. Good morning. I like the good mornings as a different option. Again, if we want to really stress our glutes and that low back a little bit, if that's our weak point, if we want to get that hip action with a little bit of a simpler movement, I would say try the good morning out. So with that good morning, I will coach the good morning as basically a 1-inch squat into a hip hinge. And one thing you watch out for here is individuals who are doing the movement with locked out legs and individuals who do their 1-inch squat and then they just bend over. Just bending over without the hips hinging backwards is going to isolate and stress the lower back. And that's okay if that's what you want. But remember, if you want hip action, your hips need to come backwards. They need to hinge backwards on the eccentric loading portion so that they're able to concentrically move forward and perform work and have muscle contraction. And that's going to apply a lot to our athletic endeavors, especially with our sprinters or work for standing athletes or running athletes, is that every time they sprint and they plant, they drive their hips forward, right? I mean, that's all it is they might stay at that same angle and that leg travels through on their sprint. And so they're just hip extending over and over and over again. And so that's why some of this lifting can help our athletes do a better job in their sport. Or if we have general population athletes, we're talking about building up some of the biggest muscle groups in the body, and that will help them stay strong in an older age. That will help raise their metabolism in their current state and get leaner, and it will just help them do laundry and carry groceries into the house and basically live a life of activity. Good mornings are done, some single legs. All right, and we'll talk a little bit more about some landmine options. We didn't break out the landmine on our squat day, but this landmine, we can use this for teaching and performing RDLs. We've got RDL options here. You can face it from different angles. You can go double leg, bilateral, unilateral, whatever it is. So remember that landmine is a great option. You can do it in any weight room. Yes, I have a little sheath and base for my landmine movements here, but you don't need that. You have a buddy stand with their feet together and you can put it right there. Or if they've got a good spot in the gym to kind of wedge the bar into, go for it. But just be aware that that landmine with that hard metal at the end of a barbell, it will chew through concrete if you're doing loaded movements with repetition in the same spot over and over again. So that's an excellent option, but can cause a lot of damage. Let's see here. Let's go with the kettlebell swing. The kettlebell was around for a little while. I've seen some photographs where it was being used in 1903, but even when it started coming around or getting repopularized in the mid 2000s, I was around it for several years, and I kind of always looked at it as like a gimmick or a toy. And then in 2014, I was out working with the Arizona Rattlers, an indoor arena football team, and Coach Leland Rogers schooled me up on it. And by the time he had me doing all these kettlebell swings, and my hamstrings felt like they were going to explode because they were so fatigued and inflated with blood, like a big bicep pump you get on arm day. I had never really gotten my hamstrings to feel like that with hardly any exercise, much less this compound explosive exercise. And as soon as he coached me up on how to do them right, I had a total mind shift and realized that the kettlebell is actually an excellent, tool for building muscle and power and strength, and I've loved it ever since. So with that kettlebell, I'll do a few swings. I'll talk about what I'm looking for, what I'm trying to achieve, and I'll talk about some of the things that are going wrong on a regular basis. All right, so hopefully I'm performing those well, but some of the things that I see go wrong regularly would be when I'm attempting to use them for building the posterior chain. I see athletes squatting in and out of the reps, so I call that like fake range of motion, as they feel like they're doing it correctly, or they believe they are, but they're hitting the wrong muscles. So that knee activation, shifting the movement from your hips down to your knees, so instead of a pull, it's becoming a push. I would say that's probably the number one issue I see. I don't know that I would call, let's see, they come through and then they like stick the kettlebell up over their head. That's not a problem per se, I would just say it's unnecessary. And what it's doing is it's building in a fraction of a second between reps. So instead of hitting those hamstrings and glutes quickly, it's hitting them a little bit of extra time, hitting them, a little bit of extra time, hitting them. So I dislike that, but I would not say that it doesn't ruin the movement. It just ruins the intensity of the movement. And also, I can't say I'm a big fan of unnecessary lifting weight over a person's head. It slips out of their hand, concussion or dented skull or whatever, and it's just kind of unnecessary. So I would say those are the two biggest issues I see on the kettlebell swing. But what I want to see would be weight on the heels, the hips go back, the hips come forward. That kettlebell, I would say another problem is a lot of people will sweep that kettlebell way down low. I would encourage you to keep it basically right under the groin or the crotch, as high as you are comfortably can be without hurting yourself or hitting yourself anywhere uncomfortable. But you're going to keep it as close to possible, as close to the body as possible down here through the hips. Once you feel those hamstrings get a stretch there, kind of like our RDL, how I was encouraging like a 7 out of 10 stretch before coming up. We want to feel a little bit of a hamstring stretch there, get the glutes fired or stretching, and then come out of that. So that's that. We're going to capitalize on that stretch reflex. So when muscles are lengthened to about 120% of their resting length, the muscle spindles start to fire a little bit, and we can create more force from that position than we can from a resting length position. So the kettlebell swing is kind of unique in that it promotes that stretch reflex. So it's almost like doing a plyometric exercise without jumping, without leaving the ground. So a lot of times I will coach jumping the hips forward or pumping as if we're going to leave the ground. So you do a kettlebell swing, except that force, instead of sending that force to send your body off the ground, you're just sending that kettlebell out and allowing it to come back in. We want to brace the core as always, and having a tight upper back is a big piece of that braced core and stable spine. If you have athletes who are performing the movement well, you can start to coach them up to throw the weight back down. So almost like I'm a younger sibling, so when I was little in the pools, I was the one getting dunked underwater. But so I know what getting dunked underwater feels like. So I'll encourage people to kind of dunk that kettlebell underwater to, once it's coming back up, instead of just letting gravity take it back down, to actually to actually kind of slam it back down underneath their hips. And that increases the speed and the velocity that's coming down at you. And then you get a bigger stretch reflex reaction. And then you're able to produce more force coming up. So there is, I'm not a physics whiz, but I've seen diagrams where they show how a 50-pound kettlebell can create 500 pounds of force at the bottom of a swing. So somebody smarter than me can rationalize that, but just trust that once we get this smaller mass item moving at higher velocities, the force and the mass of which it acts with is much greater. So even a smaller kettlebell, like 50 or 60 pounds, which is not a small kettlebell, but even that can produce almost 10 times that amount of force when used properly. Yeah, probably the last mistake or issue I see with that is athletes going too light. This is an exercise where we should be challenged. We should feel like we're almost getting ripped off of our base of position or our stance throughout an explosive good rep. So if you've got smaller kettlebells around for teaching, that's fine, but this is actually probably the only movement that I would say that adding heavier weight can help teach it. And for whatever reason it is, it's just unique in that aspect. So I would say don't be afraid to grab some heavier weights. I'm constantly encouraging my athletes when we go over to the kettlebell section. I quarantine certain kettlebells and you know, no, you can't use those. This is your range of weights that you can work with. So I might teach them initially with those smaller weights, but once we want to get working, be sure to challenge yourself, go a little bit heavier. Let's see, there's our kettlebell. There's our kettlebell. We're gonna go back to the barbell now, and we'll get in some glute bridges and some hip thrusts. So this is a simpler but still complex exercise, really popularized starting somewhere around 2010 with Brett Contreras, who coined, I don't know if somebody else coined him, but he was okay with it. He became the glute guy. And so he started, kind of his niche became how to train your glutes, how to get those hips firing and grow your butt cheeks. And one of the things that he brought into play or helped popularize was the floor-based glute bridge. And so I've got my hip pad here, not really necessarily with 95 pounds, I'm sure I would have been okay. But you're just gonna be floor-based right here, knees bent, driving off those heels and sending your hips skyward. And again, it's not as how high you can go, because when you go as high as possible, a lot of times you will activate that lower back and some of those spinal erectors, and that's not what we're going for. We just want to really pick on those glutes. Right there. Some people will argue that this is a push. That's a fine argument. I would tend to say it's more of a pull, because when we look at our triple extension of our ankles, knees, and hips, this is a hip extension isolation movement. So I label it and I program it as a pull. And that same movement you can do. Let's see if we can kind of organize ourselves on the bench over here. So quite a few ways we can do this, but the hip thrust is a glute bridge with your shoulders elevated. So what I might do is I might set my bar in a rack and then bring a bench over and put my shoulders on the bench and sneak my hips underneath the bar, and I'll do my hip thrust from there. I don't know how great of an angle this is going to be, so I'm just going to mimic it over here. So let's say this is my bar. I'm just going to put my shoulders on the bench here, and I've got my hip thrust right there. And I would say the advantage of being being elevated for that movement is you're going to get a little bit more range of motion, and with range of motion usually comes increased muscle activation and growth and potentially strength. So whether you roll a bench over by a rack, it's a little bit riskier, but you can have buddies hand you the weight once you're in position. But both are excellent exercises, and you can do several variations of that. So let's break out our physio ball here. We've got some options here. Again, so the nice thing about the ball is we're decreasing stability. And when we decrease stability, our body has to create more stability. So reducing stability is kind of like adding weight to a stable exercise. So instead of sitting in a leg press, which is one of the most stable scenarios I can think of off the top of my head, and adding weight, what you might do is, do single leg squats, or do squatting on a funky or unstable surface. So something like that. So let's see, so just focusing on our hip action, we can do straight leg glute bridges right there. We can go toes on the ball, glute bridges right there. We can elevate the shoulders, whatever scenario you're interested in getting after. There's pros and cons to each of those positions, like usual. Pull throughs. So if you have someone with a back injury, or probably a back injury is what makes this one the nicest. You can do this with a cable setup, or the band setup works pretty well. And this would be a pull through. So all we're doing is resisting that hip hinge action, and gonna kind of pick on the glutes a little bit extra. And whether it's with a cable or with a band, you're gonna suck that force into your inner thighs, so that it's not necessarily a bicep exercise or challenging your grip, but all that tension is there. I just sit that over into my thighs, and it's much easier to hold. And so I'm just hinging right there, glute action, glute action, glute action. Kind of looks like my RDL, kind of looks like my kettlebell swing, right? And if my back was really bothering me, I could annihilate my glutes and my hamstrings with a pull through like that. And then I'm going to include sled dragging examples or demos in the link below this video, in a link below this video in the description. And just, the sled drags are such a phenomenal opportunity to perform hip extension and basically pick on your glutes and your hamstrings and your calves. So it's triple extension in real world format. So I would advise going light enough so that you don't have to lean forward into a big forward lean or a bear crawl. Just something that you can hold a decent posture with a little bit of a forward lean, and we just want to pick on those glutes and hamstrings and your calves. And I'll put a demo or a video link in our description. And that's all we got for today. Thanks, guys.